What influence does the media have on how people perceive rape and sexual assault? That's one of the topics being tackled in two talks being presented by the PEI Rape and Sexual Assault Center and the Premier's Action Committee on Family Violence Prevention. Another theme includes why it's important survivors take the narrative back and share their stories. Anne Ream spent 8 years traveling internationally, listening to men and women's experiences of sexual violence, including several people sharing their stories here on Prince Edward Island. And she'll share some of what she learned tonight. Tomorrow, author and cultural commentator Clifton Spargo will discuss what difference language makes. They're both joining me here in the studio this morning to talk about their work and about an upcoming writing workshop that's happening on PEI this week. And good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Really appreciate you joining us. And Anne, I know we've spoken by phone before about this project, the Voices and Faces project. What did you hear from Islanders when you were asking them to share their stories?
I was really moved by the women and men I talked to on the island, and probably one of the reasons was I have a connection to this place, and I write about it actually in my book, Live Through This, that I used to visit Prince Edward Island when I was young from the States, and I had a very clear notion of this beautiful island and wonderful people and a security and a safety. And one of the heartbreaking things about the work I did on the island is all of that in some ways is true, and yet there is a rather large community of women and men who have come forward to talk about having survived sexual violence. And one of the recurring themes that I really grappled with as I was doing those interviews was the imperatives to silence that exist for victims when they live in a small town or in a community where there's a great deal of intimacy and in some ways not as much mobility. And the degree to which people want to come forward and want to share their stories, but feel in some way that to do so may compromise their privacy or their safety or make it impossible for them to keep living the lives that they've lived on the island. So one of the very strong themes that I heard from folks here is that they want to be able to share their stories, but they also want their neighbors and their families and their communities to still see them as total people, to still understand that they've been shaped by something violent that's occurred, but they're not defined by it, and that the way we respond to that violence is really everything for them.
And I know you're certainly an advocate of people sharing their stories coming forward. What difference can that make for a survivor?
Well, storytelling is incredibly powerful because what it allows us to do is take an experience, a traumatic experience in this case, and reframe it and define it and say, I lived through this. This is part of my narrative. It's part of the fabric of my life, but I want to tell you why it's not the defining piece of my life. And also, I want to tell you what this is so you as a community can understand how to change things. I think one of the most touching things about the people I met on the island is to a person, and I interviewed, I think, 8 or 9 women and men. They are coming forward not so much because it's personally healing or transformative, but because they believe their stories can change the way the world responds. And that desire for our stories to have a purpose, that's something universal. I was listening to your early story briefly this morning and thinking the story of that family exists so that people can say you can get through these difficult things. And that sort of notion of infusing our experiences with meaning very often allows people to live with those experiences in a more productive and healthy way.
And Clifton, this is something you're echoing in your talk this week as well, encouraging survivors to, quote, take the narrative back and share testimonies, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember what Anne was just saying, that we are, all of us, storytellers in our everyday life, that we make sense of the world and our lives through narrative. And what testimony reminds us is that there are experiences where our lives face great duress, great suffering, and there are many things in the culture working to silence us on those issues. So what happens when we talk about testimony and we talk about the Voices and Faces Project is we're trying to create an environment and a medium for people to bring those difficult stories to the public, and for the public to have to think about those issues. And that really is, if you think about the historical function of testimony and the way we use testimony, and really is something that evolved in the 20th century in response to Latin American dictatorships and the human rights tribunals that came out of that, the Holocaust and the experience that came out of that. And so it was a device for consciousness raising, for changing public perceptions, for bringing about an understanding of those events. And at the project, what we've done is to try to take our understanding and expertise and our will to share those stories, and to enable others, the survivors themselves, witnesses to survivors, so those who have been affected by the trauma, also to become skilled storytellers.
And one of the things you're tackling is how the media portrays rape and sexual assault. What influence do you believe the media is having on people and how people view these crimes?
Right. And that's a difficult question. You have to say it's double-edged, right? I'm very cognizant, and I've looked a lot at the fact that on the one hand, we've made considerable progress. If you think about the victim rights movements and the certain human rights movement and the certain kinds of protections and awareness that have put into place, a lot of that stuff is that stuff that wouldn't have been coverage. We're here on your show and you want to cover this issue. So there is a lot of goodwill toward that. At the same time, we have a culture that still works to bring about certain kinds of incentives for people not to tell their story, and popular representations, certain kinds of the Rush Limbaugh controversy from several years ago with a young woman who'd come forward to talk about contraception rights in the United States, and he used much derogatory anti-woman language just to try to silence her. Around this issue, we have a lot of pejorative uses of the word victim in our culture. You'll have people saying, she's playing the victim, don't play the victim card. And that, in a sense, registers our lack of compassion for a wide range of victim experiences. That when we say that, we're telling people we don't want to think about this experience, whether it's sexual violence, whether it's a human rights violence, such as torture. And Marina Namat is a ally of the project, and the way she's talked about torture. And a lot of those places are places we don't want to go, but they're practices of our governments and our societies, and we're permitting those things in our culture. So we have to bring about the consciousness of them in order to bring about the change of them.
And Anne, when we were talking about the importance of people coming forward and sharing their stories, not only for the individual, but for the community and understanding and looking towards prevention, what do you think, hearing these stories, what do you think needs to change in order for sexual violence and rape to be less prevalent?
Well, I think Cliff's nodding to something really quite powerful, in that every time a story is told by the media or in popular culture, film, music, whatever medium it may be, the way that story is told sends a message to those hundreds of thousands or millions of survivors who see that story being told and say, if they're going to treat her or him this way, I'm not going to come forward. It really cues that they are safer remaining silent. And I think if we don't create new ways and places for survivors to share their stories, so whether it's on our website, voicesandfaces.org, or in our book, Lived Through This, or through the Stories We Tell, which is our testimonial writing program, if we don't start to say, we're going to take those narratives back, and we're going to create places where you can share your story, or your story is going to be shared, and it's represented with dignity. We listen to the complex aspects of your story. We don't blame you. We think about our own responsibility in how we respond. We marry those stories to a call to the action to the public. If we don't engage in that sort of active storytelling versus sort of passively sharing stories, we can't change things. And then I think the second thing that has to happen is when we create places for survivors to tell their stories, those of us who are advocates, those of us who are working on these issues in the government, and you have some amazing people on this island working on gender-related violence, their job is to say, how do I get these stories in front of the opinion shapers who will create change?
And we just have a few moments left with you, unfortunately, but you're giving the talks this week, both you and Clifton, and then a writing workshop this weekend that I know people have signed up for. So just give us a sense of what will happen at that workshop, what you want to pass along to people.
What we tried to do there, we had this project in the works, and Anne had brought the Voices and Faces project to life, and we were asking people to come forward and for her to tell stories on their behalf. And we wanted then to bring something to people to help them become better tellers of their own story. And so what we try to do is create the safe environment, a structure for listening. When we talk about testimony, the other part of it is listening, and we try to create that environment where people can be listened to so that they can feel confident and develop skills as storytellers, and then to be part of the change in our culture so that as folks come forward to tell a story, that the structure, we create those structures of listening in the culture. And that's what we have to work on as a public. That's what we're doing here this morning, is if everybody's just coming forward to talk about their experience, if there's not that compassionate space of listening, then there's not a change that takes place. And so that's also what the workshop models. It's that double structure of telling and listening and becoming confident in our stories because somebody wants to hear them.
Really appreciate you both coming in. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Anne Ream sharing her talk about the Voices and Faces project tonight, 7 o'clock at the Rod, Charlottetown. Clifton Spargo's presentation on language and the media's influence tomorrow at 11:45. And the PEI Rape and Sexual Assault Center is asking people to pre-register for tomorrow's talk. We'll send out the email link, or you can call 902-566-1864. 1864.